I had been working in an electronics repair shop for a few years. The job was monotonous. Every day was the same. Cracked screens, water-damaged laptops, phones that had suddenly stopped working. People came in with the same problems, and it felt like each day was just a repetition of the last. Nothing truly interesting ever happened. I usually worked until 8 in the evening, and that day was no different. There was about an hour left before closing when a man walked in. He looked strange, tall, dressed in a long black coat, thin, with a pale face that almost didn't seem real. His features were unnaturally symmetrical, his skin so light it resembled marble. He didn't greet me, didn't ask if the shop was still open, didn't introduce himself. He simply walked up to the counter and placed an old voice recorder in front of me. I picked it up, examining the device carefully. It was a model from the 90s, the kind that had long been out of production. It should have been worn out, yellowed with age, but it looked almost new. No scratches, no scuffs, no dust. It was as if it had just come off the assembly line. That struck me as odd, but I didn't ask any questions. The client stood in silence, waiting for me to inspect the device. He didn't explain anything, didn't show any emotions. Then, at some point, when I glanced up at him, his lips barely moved, and he quietly uttered a few words. His voice was low and hoarse, almost a whisper. He spoke slowly, as if carefully choosing each word. And though what he said was simple, something about it made me uneasy. I didn't respond, but my fingers tightened around the recorder. When I looked up again, the man was gone. I hadn't heard him leave. The door hadn't creaked, the bell hadn't chimed. It was as if he had simply vanished. I was alone with the device. The shop was silent, except for the clock on the wall, ticking away the seconds. I decided to check the recorder. It was fully charged, though I had no idea where the batteries had come from. Normally, these old models required special batteries that were hard to find, but the ones inside looked brand new, yet had no markings on them. I pressed play. At first, there was only static, a faint, crackling noise, like the interference on an old recording. Then barely audible sounds, rustling, clicking, something that resembled breathing. And then I heard my own voice. I froze. It was an exact recording of my voice, as if someone had recorded me just minutes ago. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I was sure I hadn't hit the record button. I fast-forwarded a little. The tape played the sound of my breathing, my fingers tapping on the desk. Everything matched exactly with what I was doing at that moment. I had no explanation for it. Then another sound appeared, a voice that shouldn't have been there. It didn't belong to me or the man who had brought in the device. It was a different voice. It was rough, distant, like something trying to mimic human speech, but not quite succeeding. It asked if I could hear it. I quickly pressed stop, but the tape didn't stop playing. The recorder kept running, even though my fingers were no longer touching the buttons. The voice repeated its question, but this time it changed. Now it was asking if I could see it. A chill spread through my chest. I lifted my eyes and looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the monitor in front of me. There was no one behind me, but I felt as if someone was standing right there. I dropped the recorder, and it hit the desk with a dull thud. But the recording kept playing. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a question. It told me I would hear it again soon. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the shop, leaving everything behind, even my laptop still open on the counter. The next morning, I came back. The recorder was gone. I asked my co-workers if anyone had taken it, but no one knew anything. There were no records in the system of that client, no mention of the device. I was starting to think I had imagined it all when one of the technicians approached me. He silently handed me a few small objects. Batteries, the same ones that had been inside the recorder. He looked at me carefully and asked how the device had been playing if there had been no power in it. I didn't know what to say, but deep down, I felt that this wasn't over, that the voice I had heard that night would return. I didn't know when, but I knew it would happen. My name is Jake, and I've always loved hiking in the mountains. It's been my greatest passion because I've always felt at home among the towering trees, the snow, and the mist. The mountains gave me what no other pastime could, both peace and a challenge at once. Every hike was a new test, a chance to push myself and see what I was capable of. I never feared tough routes or harsh weather conditions. But one hike changed everything. Since then, I've looked at the mountains with a different perspective, one filled with caution and fear. It happened that autumn. My friend David, as always, decided to join me on the next hike. I left the route choice up to him because he was one of those people who knew how to pick the right trail and always had plenty of backup options. This time, he suggested we go to one of the lesser-known peaks in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't a popular route, and it wasn't a tourist trail, but for us, it seemed perfect. We were always drawn to places where there were fewer people, where we could really feel a connection with nature and not rely on others. We set off in the morning, and at first, everything was normal. The sun hadn't yet risen above the mountains, but it lit up the peaks with a soft pink hue. We walked slowly, enjoying the moments, talking about everything under the sun, when suddenly the weather started to change. At first, it was subtle, but then the temperature dropped quickly. Clouds filled the sky, and soon, mist engulfed us. The fog was so thick that we could barely see 3 meters ahead of us. David said we shouldn't stop and urged me to keep going. At first, it seemed fine, typical autumn weather, but over time, I started feeling something was off. The fog was getting denser and thicker, and every step was becoming more difficult. The feeling that we were losing our bearings started to grow, but we kept pushing forward. About halfway up the trail, I noticed that the forest had become unusually silent. I mean, it was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of rustling leaves, no birds, no insects, just silence. It was the kind of silence that scares you more than any noise. I looked over at David, and he was walking beside me, but his expression seemed distant, like his mind was elsewhere. His eyes were empty, as if he were looking through me. I decided it was just exhaustion, that I was probably overthinking things, but something deep inside me was telling me that this wasn't just another ordinary hike. As we moved forward, I started noticing other strange things. The stones we had passed earlier were now in different places, and the trail we were following was becoming less recognizable. I stopped and asked David if he'd noticed it too. He just looked at me and didn't answer. At that moment, I felt something was very wrong. He kept walking, and I followed him, even though something in my gut was telling me to stop. We pressed on, but soon I heard something odd. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I started to hear it more clearly, footsteps, faint, as if someone was walking behind us. I turned around, but saw nothing in the mist. Yet the sound didn't stop. These weren't our footsteps. I looked at David again, but he didn't react. His gaze was distant, and his movements were slow, like he was in a trance. With every step, I could feel the sound getting closer. It felt like we weren't alone anymore. Panic started to set in. Then I saw something in the fog. At first, I thought it was just a tree or a rock, but when we got closer, I realized it was a figure. A person? Or something else? I shouted David's name, but he didn't respond. His expression was hollow, and his movements were mechanical. I felt a chill run through my spine. The forest seemed alien, hostile. Shadows began to move at the edge of my vision, almost as if they were alive and we were their prey. I started to run. David stayed behind, motionless. I screamed his name again, but there was no answer. I tried to get away, but the more I ran, the more the mist seemed to swallow me up. I ran, not looking back, until eventually I broke free from the thick fog. My legs were aching, but I found myself at the edge of the forest. I looked back. The figure was gone, but David still hadn't caught up. I called out his name again, but there was no response. I ran toward the nearest village, my heart racing in my chest. When I went back to the spot where we had left the trail, the fog had already lifted. The forest looked the same, but everything felt different now. There were no signs, no traces of David. I returned home, hoping it had just been a nightmare, but I couldn't forget that look in David's eyes and the way he seemed when I last saw him. I never returned to that mountain, and I never told anyone what happened. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something else stalking us in that forest? I don't know, but I'm certain we weren't alone. That experience left a deep scar on my heart, and even now, when I think about that trip, I feel a sense of dread. All those things that happened in the fog, I can't explain them. Maybe I'll never know what happened to David. But what I felt in that forest that day still haunts me. It's a reminder of how uncertain our perceptions can be. And even if we can't explain what we see or hear, it doesn't make those feelings any less real. I didn't believe in any of those ghost stories or paranormal phenomena. I had a practical life. I worked at a law firm, and everything around me had to be logical and grounded in fact. My wife and friends would laugh when they talked about ghosts or supernatural occurrences, but I always replied that it was just imagination, that it could all be explained rationally. That night changed everything. It started like any other night. I was driving home from work after a late shift. It was just another dark, quiet drive along an empty road, passing through desolate villages and towns. The kind of night when the stars seemed to be muted by the distant city lights. I loved these trips. They gave me a chance to think, to clear my mind. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I appreciated it. It was always just me, the road, and my thoughts. I was on an old stretch of highway that passed through a few villages. This part of the road was the longest, and I usually didn't see many cars around. At this hour, there was only the sound of my tires rolling on the asphalt. The road was narrow, unlit, with fields and forests on both sides. But then, about a few kilometers away from the usual stop I make, I noticed something strange. At first, it seemed like a shadow cast by a tree or perhaps a cloud drifting across the sky. But as I got closer, the feeling started to shift, and I realized something wasn't quite right. It was a figure, indistinct, dark, and blurry, standing right on the side of the road. I couldn't make out its shape clearly, but it resembled a person. And yet it felt off. Something wasn't right. I had passed through this area many times before, and I'd never seen anyone there at that hour. The figure stood still, silent, staring at nothing. I slowed down, instinctively trying to figure out what it was. Maybe it was someone who needed help, I thought, or someone who had lost their way. But as I got closer, the unease grew stronger. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my headlights. It was like it was frozen in place. The shadow didn't look like it belonged to anything in the real world. There was no detail to it, no clear outline, just an indistinguishable black shape against the night. I rolled down the window, trying to speak. "Hey, are you okay?" But there was no response. The figure just stood there, silent. I asked again, but still nothing. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. It was unnatural. My heart started racing, but I tried to shake it off. I was probably just tired. Maybe it was some kind of trick of the light. But then, as I kept driving and was almost past the figure, I turned to look at it once more. It was gone, just like that. The figure had vanished, disappearing in an instant, as if it had never been there. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't sure what had just happened. I looked around but saw nothing. The silence felt even heavier now. The road seemed unnaturally still. There were no sounds. The air felt thick, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired. But as I drove further down the road, I felt the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. The tension in the air seemed to grow with every passing mile. And then, in the distance, I saw another figure. It wasn't the same one, but it was the same shape, distant, unmoving, and just as unsettling. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The figure was far away, but I could still make out its dark silhouette against the night. It was standing on the edge of the road, watching me. But its face, it was impossible to make out. It was like a void, an empty space. The fear gripped me, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, not daring to look back. The fear overwhelmed me, and I sped off, not caring about the road anymore, just desperate to leave that place behind. The sound of my tires on the road was the only thing I could hear as I raced away from whatever I had just encountered. I didn't return to that stretch of road again. Every time I passed by, I felt that same strange sense of dread. I never saw the figure again, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there, waiting just beyond my sight. The shadow that had vanished so quickly left an impression on me that I could never shake off. Now, whenever I drive on that road, I'm always on edge. I can't help but glance at every shadow, every dark corner. I know it's irrational, but I feel like something is watching me, something that isn't entirely human. And even though I try to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, a part of me knows I'll never forget what I saw that night. I may never find out what truly happened, but I no longer dismiss the stories. I'm no longer the skeptic I once was, and I'm not sure if I want to know the truth about the shadow on the road. Sometimes, some things are better left unexplained.